The Legend of Zelda series is one of the most critically acclaimed video game franchises of all time, but it seems that every time a game in the series is released, it's quite divisive amongst the Zelda fanbase. After Ocarina of Time, Nintendo released Majora's Mask, and people thought, huh? This game has so many weird mechanics and isn't at all like Ocarina of Time. What is this? Nintendo, give us what the fans really want, another Ocarina of Time. And when Nintendo released Wind Waker, people thought, huh? This game is fun, but it's too cartoony, and I look gay playing this game. Nintendo, give us something dark, realistic, and manly, like Ocarina of Time. So Nintendo finally gave in and released Twilight Princess, a darker and more realistic Zelda game in November of 2006 for the Wii. And people thought to themselves, huh? This is too realistic and uncreative. Where's the unique art style and mechanics like Wind Waker and Majora's Mask? We don't want just another Ocarina of Time. It really seems like Nintendo just can't win with the fan base when they release a 3D Zelda game. Even Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild have had their fair share of divisiveness in the community. Over the years, despite mostly receiving praise, Twilight Princess still stands as one of the more divisive games out of the 3D Zelda installments, with many seeing the game as unoriginal and some saying that it's aged poorly. But I've always disagreed with that, and I've been a defender of this game since day one, baby. And everyone who doesn't like this game just has bad taste, and I'm more intelligent than them for liking this game, because this game is the best thing since sliced bread. In this video, I'm going to be discussing why The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is not only a great game, but also my favorite Zelda game of all time. Also, it goes without saying, but I should probably mention that this video will have spoilers, so, watch out for those, I guess. Anyways, with all that being said, let's get started. Twilight Princess has one of my favorite gameplay systems in the entire Zelda series. Combat-wise, Zelda games are usually nothing to write home about, but I actually like how Twilight Princess handles combat. In your average Zelda game, typically all you can do is swing your sword and maybe do some cool moves like jump attacks or parry moves. But in Twilight Princess, you get the basic combat moves along with 7 hidden skills that can be learned from the hero spirit. These skills are a great addition to the combat and definitely spice things up. It always feels very satisfying to learn these skills, and even more satisfying to actually use them in battle. I also always loved how this game lets you actually do combat on horseback, unlike prior Zelda games. And I also love how there are even several boss fights that you are required to do on horseback. Twilight Princess took the basic battle mechanics that every 3D Zelda game had used up to this point, and expanded upon them in a very simple yet effective way. And that's why Twilight Princess has my favorite combat system in the series. Except for maybe Breath of the Wild, but, you know. That game's a bit different than your average Zelda. One thing I wish the game did better with, however, is the overworld feeling a bit barren. Hyrule Field is incredibly big, but barely has anything to do in it, outside of collecting bugs for a creepy 10-year-old and occasionally finding a heart piece. This is especially disappointing when coming off of Twilight Princess's predecessor, Wind Waker, which had one of the best and most well-designed overworlds in the entire franchise, with a large world and tons of things to find and puzzles to solve. But Twilight Princess is mostly just empty space. However, that's not to say that all the areas in the game are bad, since there are still some very nice areas that I like visiting and exploring, such as Lake Hylia, the Faron Woods, Death Mountain, and most of the towns, such as Kakariko Village, Castletown, and Ordon Village. I just wish that the game was a little more packed with things to find. Twilight Princess also has my favorite items in the entire series, since it not only has all the classic Zelda items such as bombs, the claw shot, a bow, a boomerang, and a slingshot, but it also has several new great items such as the spinner, the ball and chain, the Dominion Rod, a fishing pole, and Twilight Princess was also the first Zelda game to have the double claw shot and bomb arrows. The amount of items in this game is astounding, and they're all very fun to use and allow for a lot more gameplay variety and more interesting puzzles than previous Zelda games. The only complaint I really have in regard to the items is that I wish some of them were used more. Once you complete the Arbiter's Grounds, there's never really a purpose to use the spinner ever again. The spinner can be used to find some heart pieces in the overworld, but other than that, it's basically never used again throughout the entire game. It's actually pretty sad, since the spinner is the best thing ever and is so damn fun to use. The The same thing goes for the ball and chain as well as the Dominion Rod. This is pretty sad since these are great items that are super fun to use, and I'd actually love to have a reason to use them. But regardless, the items in this game are great, and Twilight Princess has my favorite selection of items in the series. One of Twilight Princess's defining gameplay elements is the ability to transform into a wolf, which is quite fun and adds a nice layer to the gameplay. In Wolf-Link form, instead of attacking using your sword, you now attack by biting the enemy. You can also dig holes to find hidden items and go underground. And you can also use your enhanced wolf senses to follow certain scents. Also, you gain the ability to do this weird thing with Midna, and I'm not quite sure how it works, but it's pretty cool. There are also these kind of fetch quest parts of the game where you have to play as Wolf-Link in the Twilight Realm, and you have to collect some tears to revive the spirits of light. A lot of people seem to hate these parts and say that they're the worst parts of the game, but honestly, I thought these were pretty good, especially the one in the Elden Province. That one's actually great. I quite like the wolf mechanic. It definitely adds more depth to the gameplay and is quite fun to use. However, by far my favorite thing about Twilight Princess is the excellent dungeons, which are in my opinion the best in the entire series. The dungeons are quite similar in style to the ones from Ocarina of Time, but I think Twilight Princess's dungeons are much more consistent in quality and more interesting. The first dungeon in the game is the Forest Temple, which is one of the weaker dungeons in the game, but it still stands as one of the best opening dungeons in a Zelda game, and is still a pretty good one. It definitely suffers for being the first dungeon in the game, because it's definitely one of the easier dungeons, but, you know, that makes sense because it's, well, the first one. But it still has some redeeming qualities. The atmosphere is great along with the music, the Gale Boomerang is a very nice item, and also this dungeon has some pretty cool monkeys in it, which is always a good thing. Diababa is a pretty mediocre boss fight, but overall, it's still a good dungeon. The second dungeon in the game is the Goron Mines, which is easily one of the best fire dungeons in the entire series. I like the unique level design in this one with the usage of the iron boots, and the dungeon itself is visually pretty great. The fire looks great in this game, and the mine theme is pretty cool. Well, actually, I guess it's not cool. It's pretty hot, actually. Thank you everyone, thank you. In this dungeon, you get the Hero's Bow, which is the quintessential Zelda item, and it's also great in this game. However, Fyrus is probably my least favorite boss fight in the game, since it's just such a basic and uninteresting fight, but at least his design is cool. Well, actually, it's not cool. It's pretty hot. The third dungeon in this game is the Lakebed Temple, which is typically the most hated dungeon in this game, and one of the most hated in the entire series. But I'm just so quirky and weird, so I actually think this dungeon is amazing. Sure, this is one of the most confusing dungeons to navigate, but it never felt annoying or tedious. I think the atmosphere of this dungeon is perfectly executed, with the ominous music and the forbidding ambience. But in an odd way, it kind of feels peaceful. The Claw Shot is also one of the best Zelda items ever, and its use in this dungeon is pretty great. Morpheal is a fun boss fight, and having a fight take place underwater is a pretty good concept. So honestly, I really don't get the hate for this excellent dungeon. The fourth dungeon in this game is the Arbiter's Grounds, which seems to be the fan favorite dungeon in the game, and it's pretty easy to see why. This dungeon is phenomenal, though it is pretty dark and scary, so every time I get to this part of the game, I make sure that the lights are on and my TV's brightness is all the way up. I'm actually impressed that Nintendo was able to get away with some of the stuff here. Like, some of the stuff in this dungeon is downright terrifying. There are mini skeletons, ghost rats that climb on you and you can't see them unless you're in wolf form, and of course, how could you forget the Gibdos, which this game has by far the most terrifying ones in the series. Oh, this game is so scary. Why is this game so scary? I can't play this anymore. I mean, I guess there's a reason why this is the only T-rated Zelda game. This dungeon is a giant prison that's in complete ruin, and it has an incredibly foreboding and uncomfortable confined atmosphere. along with terrifying music to go along with it. But the puzzles in this dungeon are great, and I love the usage of the wolf form for hunting down the pose in the first half of the dungeon. And you get the spinner here, which is one of the best items in the entire series, because it lets you do this! You know, maybe this dungeon isn't so terrifying after all. It's basically a giant skate park, but for spinning things that can attach to rails. Stalord is easily one of the greatest bosses in the series, because you get to use the spinner. By the way, have I talked about how much I love the spinner yet? It's such a great fight, and it feels very satisfying to play. Stalord is a contender for my favorite boss battle in the entire game. I love this dungeon, and it's easily one of the best in the series. The 5th dungeon in the game is the Snow Peak Ruins, which is a giant mansion where some weird Yeti couple lives. And out of all the mansions that appear in video games, this one is my second favorite. This dungeon is probably my favorite in the entire game, because I love how unique it is compared to any other Zelda dungeon. Snow and ice themed dungeons are pretty rare, especially in 3D Zelda games, and I love the weird and cozy feeling this dungeon has. I love the Yeti couple, especially my man Yeto, who I just recently learned isn't named Hugo. I thought his name was Hugo for like the last 13 years. Is this a common misconception, or am I just dumb? I love how the entire time you're in the dungeon is just spent getting a key to a bedroom, but this damn Yeti keeps leading you to some random food items. The ball and chain is a great item, and the Blizzetta boss fight is incredible. It's very fun to fight, and Yetta being the boss of the dungeon is a pretty unique and fun idea. Blizzetta is also a contender for my favorite boss battle in the game. I also love how you can go snowboarding with Hugo and even get refills of his soup after you finish the dungeon. This is more proof that he's the best character in the game. The 6th dungeon is the Temple of Time, which is a bit of a drop in quality when compared to the previous dungeons, due to it having a pretty bland atmosphere and color scheme, and it doesn't really stand out compared to the rest of the dungeons, but it still has some pretty cool puzzles, and the Dominion Rod is a great item because it lets you control a statue with a giant hammer. The Armagoma boss fight is pretty alright, but I just feel like there could have been a much better boss fight for this dungeon that would have been a lot more fitting. But regardless, the dungeon's still pretty good, just definitely one of the weaker ones in the game. The 7th dungeon in the game is the City in the Sky, which is the home of the Ukas, and it's such a serene and beautiful dungeon, which serves as a very nice change of pace. The music here is great and really makes you feel like you're reaching the end game. The double claw shot is one of the greatest things to ever exist in all of humanity, and Argarok is a brilliant boss fight and is also a contender for my favorite boss battle in the game. Yeah, if you couldn't tell already, I think this game has the best boss fights in the entire series. This fight is easily one of the most exhilarating moments in the whole franchise, and the battle arena is incredible since you're super high in the sky trying to get on top of this giant dragon. The only major complaint I have with this dungeon is that it can sometimes be a little bit slow to navigate, and there's a lot of waiting involved, but it's not a huge deal since this dungeon is meant to be quite peaceful anyways. The 8th dungeon in the game is the Palace of Twilight, which is probably my least favorite in the entire game, but I still think it's alright. I love the environment and feel that this place has, and the music here really makes you feel as if you've stepped into an otherworldly place. However, I always felt as if this dungeon was a little bit too easy and felt a bit underwhelming for how long this place has been hyped up throughout the game, and getting an upgrade for the Master Sword is a little bit of a disappointment, because even though it's pretty nice, I guess, I would have preferred a proper item instead. However, the Zant boss fight is pretty great, and the multiple phases of the fight serves as a very nice recap of the journey. So even though this dungeon is my overall least favorite, it isn't bad by any means. I just think it's a bit mediocre and underwhelming. The 9th and final dungeon of the game is Hyrule Castle itself. I think Hyrule Castle does a great job of setting the tone for the final boss, but as a traditional dungeon, it's not very great. It's pretty easy, and it's quite short compared to the other dungeons, but it serves a very different purpose than the other dungeons, so for that, I consider it a pretty good dungeon. The 4 phases of the final boss also make it what is, in my opinion, by far the best final fight in the entire series. Twilight Princess has my favorite dungeons in the series, because out of 9 dungeons, literally none of them are bad, and there are only 2 I consider to just be mediocre. Every Zelda game has at least one dungeon that I actually think is bad, but this game is an exception to that. Overall, Twilight Princess by far has my favorite gameplay in the series, with a good combat system, great item lineup, the Wolf Link mechanic, fantastic dungeons, and wonderful boss fights. The only real issue I have is that I wish some of the world was less barren, but the world still has plenty of nice areas. But anyways, now let's talk about the story, characters, and atmosphere. The story of Twilight Princess begins with Link, who works at a ranch in a small community of Ordon Village, when one day their village is attacked by some boblins, and they take the children from the village. Link then tries to chase them, but is pulled into the Twilight Realm, where he transforms into a wolf. Link is then brought to a jail, where he is then freed by a mysterious imp-like person from the Twilight Realm named Midna. Midna takes Link to see Princess Zelda, where he is then told that the usurper king of the Twilight Realm named Zant invaded Hyrule Castle and caused Zelda to surrender. Zant then engulfed the entirety of Hyrule in Twilight, and Zelda then says that it's up to Link to free the land of Hyrule from the Twilight, and that's where the story begins. It's a pretty unique plot setup for a Zelda game, and I actually really like the way they handled the storyline. Even though the game does go down the typical save the kingdom and defeat Ganon storyline, they help make it less cliche by actually giving Ganondorf a backstory and character, unlike previous games such as Ocarina of Time. And the inclusion of the Twilight Realm with characters like Zant and Midna really helps spice up the story and keep things interesting. So while the story may not be groundbreaking for the series by any means, it certainly is interesting and pretty solid. One issue I do have with the story, however, is that I really wish the opening was shorter. I really don't care to spend the first 2 hours of the game herding goats and calling for birds so that I can get a baby cradle back from a monkey. What? Other than that, however, I think that this game's pacing is pretty great. Twilight Princess also has some pretty good characters. Midna is easily the best companion character in the series. She actually gives useful tips in gameplay and isn't annoying unlike many other Zelda companions. And she's easily one of the most interesting characters during the actual story. I think her backstory and character arc is pretty great. Zant is also one of the absolute greatest Zelda villains, and as I said earlier, I think this is one of Ganondorf's best appearances in the entire series, and he's a pretty good twist villain of sorts. And the game has one of my favorite supporting casts in the series. I really like how, unlike previous Zelda games, Twilight Princess actually has characters that have notable character development and backstories, and for that reason, I think it possibly has my favorite cast in the entire series. Though I will say that I think Twilight Princess Link is one of the more bland Links, and has much less personality than Wind Waker and Skyward Sword Link. Twilight Princess Link just kinda comes off as a very bland, stoic character compared to the other ones, which isn't a big deal because Link usually isn't very interesting anyways, but considering he's a silent protagonist, I would have liked a bit more personality than just a blank slate. Twilight Princess is also full of weird and bizarre minor characters, which seems to be a tradition for the franchise now. You have characters like Agatha, who is so terrifying that I frequently get nightmares involving her. Oh, it was just a nightmare about Agatha. That's alright. I'll just go back to sleep. And you have this weird guy who lets you buy cuckoos so you can fly over a lake, and this weird clown guy who runs a place where you can get blasted out of a giant cannon, which is very efficient for transportation, but the business probably won't last very long as I think it's definitely quite dangerous and probably breaking some laws. You have the very strange Ukus, this dumb guy who sold his soul to some ghosts and became a gold statue, and he wants you to collect some souls for him so he can be normal again, which is honestly a very relatable situation to be in. There's this weird 4-year-old who runs an entire store and becomes a millionaire, and best of all, you can talk to cats in this game. Do I really need to explain why this game is the best one in the series? Twilight Princess has a very good cast of main characters, as well as a great cast of side characters, and it easily stands as one of my favorite casts in the entire series. By far one of my favorite aspects of this game, however, is the atmosphere. I think this game does the greatest job of setting the atmosphere and tone compared to any other game in the series. I think a major part of this is due to the art style, and especially the game's very unique and dark color palette. However, I think the main reason why the game is so atmospheric and immersive is because of the brilliant soundtrack. The cutscene music is incredible and fits the mood excellently, the dungeon themes always fit the environment and really immerse you into the dungeons, and the music that plays in the Twilight Realm really helps boost the creepy and mysterious ambience so much. The game has a very gloomy, mysterious, and melancholic atmosphere, but it nails it thoroughly, and I think it's the best atmosphere in the series. A lot of people complain about Twilight Princess being way too derivative of Ocarina of Time, but I almost completely disagree. The game is honestly one of the most unique games in the series. I mean, sure, visually and aesthetic-wise, it definitely takes from Ocarina of Time, and games like Wind Waker have definitely aged better graphically because of the more stylized art style, but honestly, It's kind of hard to imagine what Twilight Princess would be like without the realistic art style. And even though the game does have realistic graphics, I still think the actual art design makes up for this because of its unique color palette and area design. I really don't think this game is aged as poorly as some people say. And yeah, the only reason this game is realistic looking is because it's what the fans wanted at the time, and not what the writers wanted to do. But outside of that, this game is super unique. The story is easily one of the most unusual in the series, and conceptually, it's much more unique than something along the lines of Wind Waker and Skyward Sword. It seems to me as if the development team gave the game a realistic style since it's what the North American fans wanted, but they still managed to write a story and create a world completely unique to Twilight Princess. Obviously, fans weren't begging Nintendo to make a Zelda game where Link enters the Twilight Realm and turns into a wolf and meets a weird imp girl from another dimension and is told to save Hyrule from Twilight. That was entirely added to the game because the developers wanted to write a story and world based on that idea. And all the alluring dungeon concepts, items unique to Twilight Princess, and interesting characters proved that the writers still had the freedom to do what they wanted with the game. So I've really never understood it when people say that Twilight Princess is uninspired, because to me, it's always felt like one of the most inspired and heartfelt games in the franchise, and I love it for that. Overall, Twilight Princess has a very interesting and well-written story. Despite the slow opening, the game has a very wonderful main cast and supporting cast of characters, the game has one of the best atmospheres I've ever seen in a video game, and the game is incredibly unique and interesting despite its uninspired visual style. Now, on to my final conclusion about Twilight Princess as a whole. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess really is better than sliced bread. And trust me, I've tried both.
Ugh. That's pretty good.
Though the game is not flawless, it does have some issues such as a mostly barren world, a slow opening, and uninspired graphics. However, it also has so many amazing elements, such as the combat system, fun items, the Wolf Link mechanic, the best dungeons in the series, brilliant boss battles, an interesting story, a great cast of characters, a brilliant atmosphere, and an excellent soundtrack. For those reasons, it's always been pretty disappointing that people always say that Twilight Princess is one of the most uninspired Zelda games, and they write the entire game off just because of that, even though that's blatantly not the case at all. In my opinion, Twilight Princess is so great since it takes the best elements of every Zelda game that came before it and expands upon them in very interesting ways, along with adding its own new ideas that work wonderfully. Twilight Princess is not only my favorite Legend of Zelda game, but one of my favorite games of all time. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, thanks for watching, and don't forget to go and drink some water. Goodbye. Thank you.